agricultural and estates. That's at least anecdotally, those are the residents who have come in, or the potential residents who have come in and have found it infeasible to build, specifically in the ag zone portion of the township. So the primary drive here is to at least propose changes in that district. And I think we would look somewhere in that lower floor area range within our single-family residential zoning districts. I don't think we've picked a number yet, Vidya and I, but based on some of the comparison community information, you'd probably be looking at something more like 1,200 to 1,500 for the ag district. Now, the other R districts are a little trickier because, from my relatively new perspective with the township, I can see how in the past there's been a good pattern established for our R1 districts. Kind of the higher density you are, the smaller lot size you are, the lower that floor can be. Building up to that R1A district, which is some of the larger acreage, some of our bigger PRD projects have 1,800 square feet. So it will take some more fine-tooth comb research to figure out if it's logical to scale those down as well, because I think there was some good thought behind how they were set up initially. But the first question is, do you agree we should look at the ag district and lower that? And then I think the second question, which may be more involved, is do we look at all the other R1 districts as well? But that's a long way of saying we don't have a number picked for the ag district yet, but we're just looking to start the research on lowering it.
Yes, but Director Power and I generally are not, we are not viewing this as a sliding scale, that if the ag district goes down from 2,000 to 1,200, all of the corresponding sizes for R1A down to R1C will also slide and become really tiny homes. That's not what we are looking at. There might be marginal adjustment, but our key focus is on the ag district, which just seems to be a little out of sync. We might look at the other district also just to make sure that what we have there is reasonable. But like Director Power said, we haven't dug too deep into it. We didn't want to go too much into it till we got an idea from the Planning Commission whether this is something you would like us to visit or not.
Thank you. Yes.
Question. When you came up with those 1,200 square feet, are those current? I mean, I know they're current as of today, but do we know when they were put into place? Were they put into place when the township was considered into a zoning situation to where they have started the establishment, or are those ones that they have adjusted over time to that size?
You're talking about Van Buren Townships?
Oh, I'm talking about the other ones when they're saying 1,200 square feet.
The other communities?
The other communities, yes, I'm sorry.
That's a good question.
I haven't looked at when their ordinance regulations were adopted. I could probably tell you that Lime Charter Township was changed over the last few years in order to keep up with the times. Probably as was Canton. The rest of them, I'm not really sure at what point of time they changed their regulations or whether this is what they've historically had. But I can definitely look into that and see if they too revisited the ordinances to fix it.
Commissioner Barr, you had a question?
Yeah, through the chair. Thank you. So I'm all for looking at this. And I guess a question I have, so if the Michigan Building Code is like sufficient to provide for, habitable housing, why are we, just in general, why are we looking at sort of requiring a certain footprint here, right? Like, why do we feel a need to regulate this further versus like some area that says, hey, this is really not regulated at all, because we already know there's like a foundation here at play.
That's a really good question that I think is reflective of, the answer is reflective of probably some of the history of some of the earlier subdivision development in the township. We strategically develop different zoning districts that have different minimum home sizes, which can come with a certain aesthetic quality. And that's why some of our PRD projects that were developed 20, 30 years ago have a strict, 1,800 square foot net floor area requirement for all their homes. And so I think that's absolutely true. The building code allows for it sets a standard for a safe minimum. We've just tiered up and above and beyond that just to achieve a certain scale of housing for a certain scale of lot size under the different zoning districts. Maybe, Vidya, if you could give your perspective on that as well.
Yes, I think the Commissioner raises a very good point. Why wouldn't we do away with tiny homes and all coming up, um, I have seen homes proposed in some of my municipal clients as small as 400 square feet. Now, having homes that size really alters the character of a neighborhood. So the problem is, if we do not have a minimum standardized size, say we have a neighborhood with R1C lots, the lots are anywhere in the 8,000 square foot range, and you might end up having one house that's only 400 square feet big. If there is just one person living, they might say, yep, 20 by 20 is good enough for me. And you might end up having one home that is all the way up to 2,500. They might just build it 2.5 stories. As long as they meet the setbacks, they could put in as big a structure as they want to. I believe the minimum dwelling size requirements are to provide for some sort of cohesive development pattern which creates neighborhoods.
Yes.
So I'll make a comment that I do think this is worth exploring more. I agree that there's seems to be a desire for people to move into smaller houses, empty nester type houses. I understand there's a need for that in the community. So maybe looking into reducing the square footage is certainly worth looking at. Some of the questions that I would want to have explored were you to continue doing this. I would want to know how many total acres are being discussed or would be affected by a change, total acreage. I would probably want to know, if you get it through SEMCOG or our local databases, what the average or median square footage of a single-family residence is in those districts. So, how many 2,000 square foot minimum floor area houses are currently in the ag district? So what are we doing if we make it smaller? How are we changing the mix of houses in that district? I will also comment that I think changing the minimum floor area may have long and short-term economic effects for the township, specifically the taxable value of an undeveloped residential parcel versus one developed with a 1,200 square foot house and one developed with a 2,000 square foot house. It affects the tax base for our community, possibly for the next 100 years. And I would like to have at least some analysis of what that effect could be for the township. This isn't something that this is something that, if changed, we would recommend to the township board. And I believe that'd be a question that they would they would want to have an answer to. So I'd like to consider it before we pass our recommendation up. Other than that, yeah, I think it's worth looking at, and certainly an interesting proposal. Thank you. We can do that.
Oh, great comments, everybody. Anybody else have comments on this agenda item? Any other questions? Sounds like we're kind of in agreement to take a look at this a little more, so we're ready for a motion on it.
I'll make the motion that we direct staff to go ahead with the investigation into changing the ordinance on the square footage for the ag district.
Do we have a second? All right. Any conversation, discussion on this? Do we want to just limit it just to ag, or do you want them to look at the entire?
I'll amend it to looking at all zoning areas for residential.
All right. So, okay, thank you. So you got a motion by Commissioner Cullen, second by Commissioner Garrett. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed. Motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, brings us to our third item on the agenda, discussion regarding gasoline filling and gasoline service station zoning ordinance text amendments. Proposed amendments to Article 3, zoning districts and permitted uses regarding the categorization of gasoline filling and service stations. I think we have, again, Ms. Krishnan, correct?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. we noticed that gasoline filling stations are permitted as a principal use in the C1 local business district, the C2 highway business district, and the freeway service district. And there are really no specific design standards that govern these either. So based upon that, we went into the zoning ordinance it seemed a little unusual because in our experience, we have seen uses that generally tend to have impacts such as drive-through uses or that are automobile-centric are typically always classified as special land uses. But it seemed to be placed as a principal permitted use in all of our zoning districts. So we made a comparison with other municipalities that have similarly located commercial areas around major freeways or thoroughfares such as 94, 96, 275, 23, US 12. And based upon a comparison, we looked not just at Wayne County, we went all the way, we saw Oakland, took a look a little bit at Macomb, and went further west also. And we noticed, with the exception of one municipality, the city of Novi in the B3 General District, gas stations are invariably classified as a special land use in commercial districts across all municipalities. And they are further subjected to additional design standards. The goal of this is not to put in more obstructions or put in more red tape in approving these uses. It's just that gasoline filling stations are typically considered as a use that needs more in-depth analysis because of concerns that relate to placement of underground storage tanks, the circulation on the site, if it's located on a major thoroughfare close to other businesses, how would a 24-hour convenience store affect those businesses? The odor that might come from gasoline, a spillage, fire hazard. There are lots of considerations which are not the same as, say, reviewing a grocery store or an M1 light industrial building. The considerations for public health, safety, and welfare are a lot more in a use that is that intense. Considering the fact that the township's main commercial corridor, where most of the the C2 district, where most of our C2 parcels are located on Belleville Road, this also happens to be part of our Belleville Road overlay district. So essentially, the way the ordinance is written right now, you could pick up any parcel within our downtown and actually develop it as a gas station if it's a principal permitted use. And since we don't have any specific design standards for it, it's basically as long as the applicant complies with the setbacks, the building architecture requirements, and the landscape screening, the use will have to be permitted in those districts if they just meet the bare requirements of the ordinance. So it is our belief, based upon our master plan's vision and goal for commercial corridors and for the Belleville Road overlay district also, having a use that is higher intensity, such as an automobile filling station, at least at a minimum, needs to be placed as a special land use so that the Planning Commission will have more opportunity to provide feedback and also obtain feedback from nearby impacted properties to ensure that the site is well designed. So what we have presented before you tonight is a comparative research of how other municipalities handle it, with my recommendation that we should consider an ordinance amendment. This is not a big amendment. It is relatively a simple amendment where we would like the opportunity to place automobile filling stations or service stations as a special land use in the commercial districts and provide for some design standards for their operation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Krishnan. Do you have any questions or comments from any of the commissioners regarding this item?
I've got one. And it's probably moot as far as the question is concerned, but you're saying gasoline filling stations, does that include diesel and other fuels as well? Because there
yes,
is
it
a
would.
difference and you're dealing with different vehicles.
Services a vehicle.
Okay.
Yep.
Could you repeat that? I did not hear you, Ms. Krishnan.
It's basically any filling station that would service a vehicle, whether it's a truck filling station, a diesel, or just a petroleum product station. Basically, anything that services or provides fuel, fossil fuel to a vehicle would be considered as an automobile gasoline filling station.
Yes, fuel is part of the definition, even if
Okay.
the term is gasoline filling station or gasoline service station, but fuel is the operative word in both of those definitions. So it would include anything
Okay.
that fuels a vehicle.
What about with electric vehicles coming on? Would that also into the EV? And would that fall under that, or could Meyer put up some EV posts in there?
Come up at some point in our near future here. That is not part of what we've been discussing thus far, but it is something that, if you take a look in video, you probably have a pretty good perspective on this. But I know that Canton Township has done a lot of recent work on identifying areas that are suitable for electric vehicle charging. That's something we haven't really cracked into for this ordinance text amendment, but is worth discussing further.
Yes, EV filling stations would not be in the same category as a gasoline filling station unless the gasoline filling station decides to provide 2 spots for EV vehicles or something like that. If there is a station built that is strictly for charging of these electric vehicles, that would be considered differently. But like Director Power said, that's something we have not yet tracked, but I think it's on the horizon, so we probably need to look into that and plan for that too.
Director Bauer, since we're looking at fuel stations in general, would it be a good time now to kind of lump it all into one and take a look at both sections at the same time? I'm not sure how much more work that would entail, since this is an easy amendment. If it's just something where we could do a quicker presentation on it like we did with the fuel station.
I think that that's a good idea, because I think it's at least a good path forward for us to look at comparison communities and how they're starting to address that topic, and whether it's having ordinances that overlap with the fueling, the ordinances related to fueling stations and gas stations, or if there's other approaches we could take. It is a logical time to start looking at that, so I'd be supportive of that.
Do you have any additional questions, Commissioner Cullen?
No.
Any other feedback, questions from any of the other commissioners on this agenda item? Commissioner Jar.
I do think it's a good idea to bring our land use into line with what our neighboring communities have been doing. That everyone else considers it to be a special land use, I think, is very telling. And
Yes.
that seems reasonable. Now that it's been pointed out that it's not a special land use, yeah, that is definitely a reasonable thing that we should be looking at. I'm in favor of pursuing this further.
I think a majority of the board members agree, correct?
Mhm.
Need to make a motion on this item to continue research into it?
Through the chair, I move that we grant our staff with our consultant, that they look at the ordinance, proposed amendments to Article 3 in regards to gas stations, the zoning districts and permitted uses regarding the categorization of gasoline filling and service stations. In addition, a comparison of the research of it for special land use with special land use and design standards.
Do we have support for the motion?
I'll support.
Chairman Kelly,
Yes, Ms. Krishnan.
would the board also like us to look into EV vehicle charging stations, or maybe add a definition or add that while we are looking at gasoline, so it doesn't catch us unawares, because it's definitely on the horizon?
Would you like to amend your motion, Commissioner Atchison?
Included in this motion, I would like to add EV stations.
Support, Commissioner
I
Cullen?
support.
Get a motion by Commissioner Atchison, support by Commissioner Cullen. All in favor, say aye.
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 Seeing there's none, motion passes. Thank you so much, Ms. Krishnan.
Thank you.
Kristen, I'm just monitoring our Zoom here. We don't have anybody who has been present to make comments on any of the zoning ordinance items so far.
Thank you so much, Director Power. I was just noticing that we kind of skipped over the public comment since there was nobody in person tonight. Well, so, Ms. Hotzman,
So we're on good shape.
thank you so much.
All right.
brings us to our next agenda item, which is the item number 4, full draft Sumter Road Corridor Plan recommendation. The Planning Commission and Master Plan Consultant McKenna Associates will present a full draft of the corridor plan for the Sumter Road corridor from Bemis Road to the city limits of the city of Belleville. The plan will be recommended for consideration by the Board of Trustees to release for a 42-day review by neighboring jurisdictions. We have a presentation by staff and McKenna.
All right, I'll give a very brief introductory statement, and then I think we'll have a good presentation from our consultant with McKenna, and then we'll probably both have some things to say after that presentation, and then we can get into any public comment and any planning commission discussion on the topic. But I first, I guess, just want to thank this planning commission, all of the residents and business owners and landowners and community leaders in the Sumter Road area who have contributed to this effort so far. That includes our partners in the city of Belleville and Sumter Township. We're not done. There's a lot to go through tonight, and there's a substantial opportunity for review yet to come here, but there's just been a lot of good work with this planning commission. Steering subcommittee, which is composed of Commissioner Barr, Commissioner Atchison, Commissioner Jar. And so what you're seeing tonight is the culmination of the work of all these groups and all these people, and also the culmination of, I think, 4 subcommittee meetings and 5 or 6 one-on-one at-length discussions with individuals who have approached me to talk about the full draft. So there's been a lot of good input that has led us to this point. And with that, I guess I will turn it over to Adam. If you'd like to maybe just steer me while I'll reload the plan, because I think it's just catching up to my quick clicking. But I think Adam is going to go through high level of the bulk of the front end of the plan, which this planning commission has already reviewed, but then go through some of the recent changes and some of the more in-depth work we've been doing with identifying what's called a regulating plan, a mobility plan, and a zoning plan for this document. So I'll pull it up and we can start there.
All right, thank you, Director Power. And while you're doing that, I also just want to echo that thanks to the commissioners and especially our subcommittee members, as well as all of the residents that have, and business owners and property owners that have given us feedback over the last 9 months. And the way to do a process like this is to, take every opportunity to hear everybody's voice, everybody's side of things that they want to contribute. And I think Dan has done a phenomenal job in refereeing and just being available to get those comments out to us. And all of that work has really led to some great discussions. And I think the direction that this vision has taken is something that I don't think necessarily any of us expected 9 months ago, but it's something that I'm very proud to present to all of you this evening. So, Dan, if we want to maybe get into it in sort of the future land use plan aspect, or actually we should start with the vision statement. I apologize. And we have everyone has the most recent draft copy of the plan. And so just in the interest of time, not that everything preceding the vision statement, which is on, I believe, page 11, not that that is not important, because we've done some very good background work in kind of understanding the history of the Sumter Road corridor, how it got to that point, why it looks the way it does today. All of that material's there in the plan for you to review, but we want to get started just kind of in the real sort of meat of the plan, and that starts in the vision statement. And this statement was drafted several months ago, and I believe it's come before the commission previously, but I just wanted to take a second to review it this evening. And you can see we've kind of put it in 4 bullet points, right? We know that this corridor is the southern gateway to Belleville. We know it's the southern gateway to the economic centers of the township. But if we go the other direction down that corridor, right, we understand that it also transitions. It's a big transition between a more urban character or a suburban character.
and a rural character. And so really the term that we've come to use is semi-rural. And we'll get into kind of what's implied by semi-rural when we think about the types of buildings that we find in an area like this, the types of land uses that we find in an area like this. But I think in terms of where we want Sumter Road to go over the next 10, 20, 50 years, the important points are expressed in this vision statement. So we want to protect and preserve that semi-rural character into the future. So that doesn't necessarily mean going more of a traditional route of suburban development the way we may have seen in some other parts of the township over the last 30 or 40 years. We're not talking about urbanizing it to be more along the lines of the character of Belleville's Main Street or another urban type of center. We're talking about really protecting and preserving that rural feel or that semi-rural feel that currently exists. But at the same time, we do want to make sure that the corridor becomes, a high-quality place and a place that residents and all residents, not just those that live in the immediate area, but those that live township-wide, really can be proud of. And it's something that really is representative of the quality of place that we have in other parts of the township as well. And so to do that, the corridor will accommodate a mix of land uses that are appropriate for its existing character and its location, the corridor's location within the overall township. We want to make sure new buildings along the corridor, if anything new is built, we want those buildings to be traditional in appearance, appropriately scaled, and this is very important, adaptable to evolving future circumstances. So none of us has a crystal ball, none of us can predict the future. We do our best to try and anticipate what's going to happen. This recent discussion on the agenda about EVs and electric charging stations is a great point. How might gas stations, fuel stations evolve in the future? That's just one example of the sort of proactive planning culture that takes place here in the township. And we want to make sure that that proactivity is imbued into the vision statement, which is that we want to make sure that, a building that's designed for a single use at a single place and time that might work for 10 or 15 or 20 years, but then maybe not become economically viable and kind of be stuck in a place where it's really not adaptable to future or current circumstances. And I think that's something that we've seen in a number of instances along that Sumter Road corridor with some of the auto-oriented kind of strip mall plazas, for example. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We get to the last bullet point here. Sumter Road and nearby local streets will be safe, serene, and attractive places for all who use them. So all modes of use, pedestrians, cyclists, motorists. And the mobility plan is, I think, a very important component of this vision plan as well. So having said that, the succeeding part of the plan is now sort of implementation. How are we going to implement this vision? How are we going to lay a policy framework down in this plan to make sure that vision gets implemented? And so what you're looking at on this spread is sort of the overall future vision. And there are a number of things highlighted on this graphic. One of which is you can see that really crazy zigzaggy pink line that kind of goes along the east side, which the way this page is oriented is the top of the page, the east side of Sumter Road, and kind of snakes around near the railroad tracks. That's the border that's the jurisdictional border between Van Buren Township and the city of Belleville. And that dates back to some of the annexations that took place back in the 1960s when property owners were confronted. They got to choose which jurisdiction they wanted to be in. And so that created a very sort of sawtooth pattern here. And that really speaks to how important it is to continue to work with our partners at the City of Belleville to make sure that future zoning changes really align. Because as you can see in some of these little pockets along Sumter Road, if the township were to make a zoning change, but the business as usual continued on the city-controlled parcels, you might not get really a high-quality implementation of the plan. Another thing to look at is in terms of the lot patterns, and I think maybe we can take a better look at it on some of the other exhibits, but what you can see there on the right-hand side in the future land use plan is we really do have a very kind of unique development, especially on the west side of Sumter Road, of how these lots are configured. We have several lots that are landlocked completely. They don't have access to a public right-of-way. The first part of the plan talks about why that is. It had to do with when the railroad came through back in the 1800s, and then subsequent land development. Some of the other parcels that you see there on the west side are very long, very narrow. And if you were to go and examine them either on foot or via an aerial photograph, you'll see that maybe the first 300 to 500 feet of those owners' properties are developed with residential uses, and they're making use of some of that extent behind the residential use, but not nearly all of it. And so one of the things we noticed as a consequence of that is, there's a lot of value that's in those parcels, in that land, both the landlocked parcels and those long lots, that is kind of being left on the table. And we thought, perhaps putting a policy in place that would allow, as circumstances evolve over decades, the owners to be able to tap some of the value, develop some of the rears of those parcels. Even though that's not directly addressing the Sumter Road frontage, I think it is, to use a poor pun, part and parcel of what we're trying to do with the overall corridor. The rule of subdivision there on the northwest corner of Hall and Sumter Roads, that's another major component of this. The residents in that subdivision are very proud of it. And it too really evokes sort of a semi-rural character. It is subdivided land, but at the same time, you've got a network of gravel streets. It's very walkable. Properties are well kept, and it has kind of a rhythm and a scale that's not necessarily as dense as what you would get in more of an urban community like the city of Belleville, or even like some of the other newer subdivisions in the township. But at the same time, it's something that kind of rests as a precedent for how future residential development might look along the corridor. So maybe, Dan, we can move on. You can see the future land use plan, and really in terms of changing future land use designations, the major change is what you see there in the blue, sort of aqua blue, which is the Sumter mixed use area. And that's really kind of the main future land use category change. And we're going to talk about what the major components of that are. There was also 2 overlay districts there, one of which is what we call the SROD, or the Sumter Road Overlay District. And that's going to be something that comes into the zoning changes that would be needed to implement this plan, as well as the, we can see with the diagonal lines back there on that map when it comes back up. I'll just give it a second here.
Yes, Adam, I'll put that image back up. I attempted to call out some explanatory notes about what you're describing right now on a different graphic, but that graphic isn't working, so we'll use this.
Okay, not a problem. And so the last thing I would point to your attention is what we call the rural residential pattern area. And that is an overlay that applies actually to the east and the west sides of Sumter Road, south of Hull, in the area that's currently designated and will be in the future the rural settlement area. So when we're talking about the rural southern portion of the township. And I should mention too that the Hull Road dividing line there, where sort of the urban services boundary exists, through our engagement, we asked whether there was any appetite to revisit that, if that should change, and there absolutely was not. And if you go back to the 2006 Southside Master Plan, and again echoed in the recently adopted 2020 Township-wide Master Plan, that urban services boundary is sort of inviolable. Now, it's possible to do development right there on the corner of Sumter and Hull because you can plug into the existing urban services. But in terms of intensifying the land use to the south of Hull Road, there was absolutely no appetite for it. Many people responded, that they moved to that part of the township specifically for the open spaces, the rural character, and they did not want to see that change. On the other hand, of course, there's a lack of neighborhood focus services in the area. And so that kind of gave us a challenge to respond to. And I think, Dan, if we move forward, we can start to talk about how that got resolved. So the meat and bones of kind of building out a mixed-use district there along the Sumter Road corridor kind of comes down to an approach that involves sort of a kit of parts. We talk about building types, and we're going to talk about lot types. We designated the various lots into one of 4 categories. And then, just to kind of put it simply, on each of those 4 types of lots, there's a library of building types that would be listed as a permitted use, an accessory use, or a special land use. Again, the zoning ordinance amendments that would have to be made would be the, engine room for making this law. But as a policy, as an overall vision of, predictable vision of where we want this to go, we're showing it in the plan.
And Ed, I'm going to steal just a minute of your thunder to take a pause, and now it's going to work.
Oh, great.
So I think this is a good opportunity just to reiterate that now that we've identified an area where there needs to be this refreshed context-based look at how you develop a district like this to be semi-rural and responsive to the community, that's where we've gone in and identified an entire mixed-use district that would apply to a space like this. And that's where, when we get into the zoning aspect of it, there will be and I'm jumping the gun here, but there will be a discussion of a Sumter Road mixed-use zoning district that's part of the zoning plan recommendations. And it will identify the permitted uses, acceptable building types, and setbacks based on lot type. And that's where Adam, I think, is going to go into some slides that describe the different building types that can, like you said, a part of kits that can be applied to the different spaces within this blue area that you see on the screen to make it really work for its context and what it's adjacent to. So that's what the blue is on this screen. We'll talk about that overlay district as well, but closer to the end, I think, would be appropriate for that.
All right, thank you, Dan. That's a helpful exhibit. So to kind of walk you through the building types, and these went through many sort of revisions and iterations, but we've identified 12 building types. And again, the specifics of, dimensional standards and how they would look, all of that gets addressed by zoning. But what we want to do is use the following pages that you're going to see to give property owners, residents, everybody sort of a general guide, rather than to just say an accessory dwelling unit. What are some examples of an accessory dwelling unit? And what are some examples of some building types that maybe people aren't as familiar with? And so we can walk through them really quickly. What we've tried to do is provide 3 really ideal examples of what these buildings look like built elsewhere. And we give references to where they are. We've tried as much as possible to take examples from Michigan, so that these are places that, are architecturally consistent with what we see in Southeast Michigan or in Van Buren Township. And also, some of these may be places you've visited yourself, or if you're looking for a weekend road trip, you can take this plan out and hit the road and visit some of them in the future. There are some, however, that just don't exist in Michigan, that aren't that popular yet necessarily in the Midwest, and so we've had to go outside Michigan in some cases. But we can talk about them kind of in order. The ADU, I don't necessarily need to go into a huge amount of detail. This is one that gets discussed a lot, right? It's an accessory building. It provides space for, could be an additional residential unit, could be a home office, it could be a studio. The key point is it's a smaller building. It's separate from the principal structure or residence. And it may also contain vehicular storage. So you could have a garage unit below and maybe a residential unit above, or as in photograph number 1, which is what they call the Palmer Carriage House in Ann Arbor, there are no vehicular storage spaces. That's why the car is parked right outside. We get into some of the more interesting ones here, the Artisan Studio. This is kind of a catch-all. This is a flexible building type. And the idea is we want it to, something that can accommodate, very light imprint or light footprint entrepreneurial activities. So think about things like culinary, for example, winemaking, craft fabrication. A great example is actually not that far away in something called the Village Arts Factory that you may be familiar with over in Cherry Hill Village. And that was a former industrial building that's been turned over into sort of a little beehive for local artists and artisans. And I took a tour through there a couple of months ago, and I saw people making cosmetics. I saw people making soap, pottery, just your standard issue artist studio with painters doing their thing, jewelry makers. There were some yoga studios, things of that nature. Again, these are all sort of production-oriented industries, but they don't require you to have, heavy equipment, heavy trucks coming in, noise, externalities such as that. So it's not necessarily a factory, and yet these are kind of areas that in the economy got overlooked for several decades in terms of where can we find an adequate space that the public can interact with, but doesn't cause the typical externalities that you would if you went ahead and regulated a traditional light industrial district. We can scale that down to just the individual scale, the building scale, and we look at the artist cottage. That's a very, very simple building. It's a small floor plate building. It resembles a cottage, but again, it's intended for production of small goods that don't require sort of non-residential grade things like plumbing, mechanical, HVAC, so to speak. So again, this could be an accessory building that somebody puts behind their principal residence and just uses as a painter's studio or a pottery studio or something like that. Again, this is trying to respond to the future that we don't know. 3 years ago, we wouldn't have necessarily foreseen such a shift to people working from home or people starting these businesses during 2020 and 21 on Etsy and then actually scaling them up and beginning to grow them. And I think this is something that we want to cultivate and make it possible for people to do. Going forward, the barn style building. Note I say barn style and not barn because, again, we want to communicate to people we're not talking about necessarily heavy agriculture barns coming in on the corridor. But we recognize that, the barn style in terms of the hallmarks of its architectural character. These buildings are part of our fabric, and they are found in semi-rural areas. And as a matter of fact, there is one that's pictured earlier on the plan that is still extant there on the east side of Sumter, as a matter of fact, just north of the fire station number 2. But these buildings have been repurposed, or they've actually been built custom and used for things other than agriculture. And so many of you may be familiar with, these are all three are Michigan destinations. The Brickwalker Barn out in Napoleon, out on, I believe, US 12 and M50. That's a big wedding space. That's a big event space. And it was once a barn. It's a historic structure, but it's been repurposed. The Dexter Cider Mill, you can see there in picture number 2 out in Dexter. That's actually a new build building that was built to resemble the original barn on the site. But it's purely a retail space at the moment. It was built to be that way. The Hickory Crook Winery in Buchanan is another example. I believe that was also built to resemble a barn, but again, it's functioning as a winery and a restaurant and a tasting room. So, we can incorporate those architectural cues without necessarily saying the building has to function as heavy agriculture. We look at cottage retail. When we think of cottage retail, we think of the traditional general store. It's a building that has a lot of characteristics that resemble a traditional house out in the country. However, it's got a porch, it's got a storefront, and it's serving retail customers. A building like this has a lot of potential in this area for, a small floor plate type of retail operation that would serve local residents, such as maybe a small market, maybe another small general store, maybe something else that we haven't thought of. You can see some examples. The one on the far left in Ada, Michigan, that's actually brand new. That was completed, I believe, in either 2020 or early 2021 as part of a new traditional village that's being constructed there in Ada, which is just outside of Grand Rapids. And then we also have 2 other examples of more traditional historic general stores, one in Dixboro and one in Glen Haven. To kind of get the point across that it can be a variety of architectural styles there. The detached garage doesn't need much explanation. There are some really lovely detached garages, though, that you can buy plan sets for that use higher grade building materials, which we're showing there in pictures 1 and 2. But of course, the more traditional prefabricated steel garage that you see a lot of is also part of that. We just mean an accessory building for vehicular storage purposes only. A little more interesting, though, on the top of the next spread is the liner building. And the liner building really can take on a number of forms, but the idea behind it is that it's very skinny. It's a very skinny building. It's like a traditional retail building, but kind of on a diet. It's only about 20 to 30 feet deep. And liner buildings are being deployed in areas that were dominated by large parking lots. And it's actually a very cost-effective way to kind of redevelop a little bit of that space without putting in a huge investment, and then creating street frontage. So that you can create the sort of characteristics of a more pedestrian-friendly environment. Let's say in an area where you had a strip mall, where you have a very deep setback and the front is dominated by a parking lot. Redeveloping those are complex projects, but if you're able to maybe put in a small building that lines that street, just by doing that, you're preserving a lot of the parking in the rear. At the same time, you're creating a street wall. You're creating a much more pedestrian-friendly sort of enclosure to that street. And this is one where I don't have any examples from Michigan, but I think it would be wonderful if the first could come from the township. So you can see there's a wide range of architectural styles associated with that. The makerspace. This is a very interesting building type that I think has been around for a long time. It's just never been defined exactly as such. And that idea is, taking a light manufacturing space that's maybe a little bit larger, maybe requires a garage door or something like that, but combining that with something that allows the public to directly interact with it. So a public-facing retail shop front. You can see in those photographs 2 examples of these building types that are actively being used. One's in Ann Arbor, and it's a t-shirt shop. They print these t-shirts large scale. Again, this isn't the type of industrial operation that creates a lot of noise or a lot of externalities. But at the same time, they've got a shop front in there. And as you can see, they've put a nice sign on there. They've painted up the front. And you can just walk right in there and shop for t-shirts or browse. They have a display window there. The Cultivate Coffee and Tap House, that's over in Ypsilanti and Depot Town, and it's the same thing. In this case, what they're producing is it's a microbrewery, but it's the same concept. You have a production space, a little bit larger scale production space with low externalities and a public-facing spot. We go down to the mixed-use building. That's really kind of your basic building block for traditional urbanism or traditional commercial accommodating development here in the Midwest. You can see an example, again, from Ada, Michigan, that's brand new, although it looks like it could have been built 100 years ago. In the middle, there's an example from New Boston, which was built at least 100 years ago, and an example from Chelsea, and that's put in there specifically because they had integrated a small market, a small local produce market into one of their existing buildings. And of course, you have commercial on the ground floor and then a second floor, and that second floor could have office uses up there. It could have further professional services up there. So think about maybe a small hair salon or something like that. Or perhaps it could have a residential component, a residential loft up there. The retail building is, you take the mixed-use building, you take that second and third story off of the top, and you just have the retail option. And we're all familiar with these, and examples abound in all of our communities. And there's actually a new block of them being built right now, as you're probably aware, on Main Street in Belleville. And they all hew to sort of traditional design components, which means we want, large, transparent windows. We want an entryway that's oriented toward the street. We want them to be scaled towards the pedestrian. Another one that we've kind of teased out of the woodwork when we're talking about the unique kind of challenges this corridor confronted us with. It's the studio shed or the roadside stand. The roadside stand, as you can see, it's pretty obvious when you look at these photographs what it is, but how do you define it? You know, it's something that maybe is intended for, we say, sale and production of goods on a seasonal or intermittent basis. So you look at Chris's roadside stand, which is over in Algonac. They have flats of plants, you know, nursery-style plants. You've got one in the middle that's a little artist's booth. And then this one on the right, I actually stumbled upon that last fall in a small town in Indiana. And that actually, it's hard to tell from the photograph, but that's a little souvenir shop, and they've got gifts and local artworks and just all sorts of things hanging out in there. And that's almost like a modified garage in that case, off of a back alley that's operating as that. I think other key to take away from the sort of roadside stand aspect is it's drive up, it's not drive through. You know, when we think of a drive-through use, right, we're thinking of a McDonald's, we're thinking of a Burger King. It's something where you have to take great design pains, right, to allow for queuing of stacked vehicles. Vehicles queue up, vehicles typically order at an intercom, you know, and they pull around and they get their food typically, or in some cases other goods and services. Whereas drive up is a little bit less formal. It doesn't require that level of infrastructure, that level of pavement, the intercom. It's more of a informal, this looks interesting, I'm gonna pull off the road, I'm gonna stop here, and I'm gonna look around. And then lastly, the workshop building type. Again, it's similar to the detached garage, limitation of about 5,000 square feet in floor area. So it doesn't get, you know, to the point where we're talking about a light industrial building. But again, it's more personal in nature, but it can accommodate larger vehicles and, again, very light manufacturing uses. And you can see that there are some very nice looking workshop buildings out there that you can build, but we do want to show that you know, the more traditional you know, prefabricated buildings are part of that family as well. And you can take it upon yourself to read the two case studies. I've talked about the Village Arts Factory. The Bear Claw Coffee Company, if you've never been to one, highly recommend you take a nice drive and visit one of them. They've built several of these around the region, and they're all sort of in these semi-rural transitional areas, and they're little drive-up stands. The one that's pictured is over in Dexter Township. And so after you take a look at the Dexter Cider Mill building we showed earlier, and just go up the road and grab a coffee at Bear Claw, and you can kind of get the sense of, you can just kind of drive up, order at this window. There are some picnic tables, but otherwise it sits on the corner of two fairly well-traveled roads in that township. So not unlike the corner of Sumter and Hall Road.
Adam, what I might do here, just to be a little improvisational, I think what I'm going to do is have these next few slides available for you to kind of go over the basics of the 4 lot types in which these buildings sort. But maybe next to that screen, we can have a map that shows what's going to end up being the regulating plan, so we can kind of show you where these lie in the district as Adam describes them. So let me pull up a single page view here. And Adam, if you want to start describing the anchor lot, I will pull it up on our map screen as well.
Excellent idea. So we've introduced the building types, and now we're going to show you the lot types. And kind of where this comes together is that there's a table on each of those spreads, which then shows which building types would be permitted special land use or accessory structures on each of those lot types. So I'll wait till Dan gets his map all set. I think the first one we want to talk about is the anchor lot. And the anchor lots are designed to be those areas right on, immediately adjacent to the corners of Sumter Road and Hull on the south side of Hull, and also Sumter and Bemis on the north side of Bemis. We haven't gone all the way down to Bemis Road yet very much in our discussion, but that's also a part of this plan. That's right at the interface with Sumter Township. And Sumter Township has commercial uses there on the southeast and southwest corners of Sumter and Bemis Roads currently. the 2020 master plan all the way back to the 2006 South Side master plan had programmed future land use for some light commercial uses on those two corners on the Van Buren Township side. And we call those local commercial. And so what the goal of the anchor lot designation is to allow those commercial uses to come in, but to maybe come in a way that promotes more of a village-oriented kind of node. A place where people can, feel comfortable getting out of their cars and walking around, or if they live within reasonable distance walking to, or if they live a little further afield, comfortable biking to as well. So kind of moving away from what we think of as maybe the way you would traditionally have developed a corner like that in a rural area where it would be otherwise dominated by parking and maybe larger retail uses with deep setbacks. And you can kind of get a general feel for what we're looking at in those SketchUp renderings there that you see on the page. And as a matter of fact, this one is sort of hypothetical. Again, hypothetical, one potential vision for that type of development if it were to occur there on the north side of Bemis Road, right there at the Sumter intersection. And Dan's got the interactive map pulled up, and so you can see more clearly exactly what we're talking about. We're not talking about very much depth, and I can't remember, Dan, what we're talking about in terms of depth there. Were we looking at like 250 feet to the west and east?
5 acres in area. Yeah, the depth I think is somewhere between 400 and 500.
Okay.
Let me, just so we can look here tonight, it's something like 500 plus feet. No, a little less than 500 feet square. So that's the kind of area you're looking at. And is it fair to say, Adam, that these anchors are kind of focal intersections of the district where you might have a retail or a service activity, kind of a draw in the front of these lots. And you might have also a kind of a production or even light manufacturing component or a workshop component in a way that services what's closer to the corner. So it's all a matter of design, how that all comes together. But this type of lot, what you see here at the intersection of Hull Road and what you see at the intersection of Bemis Road is really intended to be a versatile type of lot that catches a lot of different potential land uses right at the corners.
Exactly, and this is a lot type where we've put layers in there as well. You can see in that table, the allowable building types table, that there's a front layer and a rear layer, and you have a different subset of those building types that would be deployed on each of those. So if we take a look at that, in the front you might have the cottage retail, you might have a liner building, or a more of a traditional mixed-use building, or a traditional retail building. And all of those are shown as principal permitted uses. Or you may have the roadside stand there, which would be an accessory permitted use. So again, really the things that attract people, the things that need visibility, those would be towards the front of those lots. And then toward the rear, you might have an artisan studio, you might have an artist cottage. You might put a barn-style building back there, for example, if somebody wanted to put a market right there on the main frontage and have some sort of a nursery or something component. That might deploy that barn type. That might go more in the rear. And the workshop's also an accessory permitted use. So it's those more destination-oriented, more retail-oriented, commercial-oriented subsets of the building types that are programmed there for the anchor lots. Okay, so we'll move on to the deep frontage lots. And you can see those there in the light blue. Actually, they're the light blue with the dark blue borders, correct, Dan?
Yeah, let's call it purple borders, yes. Light blue with purple borders. That's these, you'll see a better image in the plan that shows how it all lays out. But yes, it's mostly those lots on the west side of Sumter Road that aren't landlocked, that have that depth to them.
Exactly. And what you see there in the SketchUp model is, imagine you're hovering there above Sumter Road, north of Hall Road, looking west of those, looking to the west. And, the idea, again, is there's a lot of potential untapped value to the rear of those parcels. And, if, policy came into place where rear access was provided in the future, and we can talk about that in the mobility plan, but let's say a new access road was provided at the rear. Even if a new access road wasn't, a property owner could develop the rear of those lots with some of these building types. But if rear access were provided, perhaps that property owner would then have the incentive to maybe split the unused portion off and have somebody else develop that. And what would that look like? We're talking about really very kind of low-key, low-intensity uses. So we're not talking about necessarily intensifying these a great deal. So the single-family home is principal permitted use, as it currently is in most of the cases there on the front. That's what they're being used for. The detached garage, of course, is an accessory use, and maybe a cottage retail building would be appropriate to go in there. That's listed as a principal permitted use on the front, so meaning that would have direct access onto Sumter. And the studio shed or the roadside stand might be appropriate there as a special land use. If the rear of those lots were to be developed, then you're getting into something like maybe an accessory dwelling unit or a barn-style building or a workshop as further accessory buildings to what's currently on those parcels, or otherwise an artisan studio or an artist cottage. So giving property owners a lot more flexibility to maybe extract some more value out of the sort of underutilized deep parcels. And that's the key takeaway for the deep frontage lots. We move on to the shallow frontage lots, and there's a few more of them, and they're scattered throughout the corridor. And you can see it's the sort of powder blue color again, outlined in red. And you can see that those line Sumter Road there closer to the Hull Road intersection on the east and west. And then as we move north up the corridor, a little bit more toward the city of Belleville, we have a handful of them on the east side of Sumter Road as well. And there's sort of a variety of conditions that are sort of these lots need to respond to in terms of how they might be used. Again, we want to sort of provide some more flexibility because basically, you have a number of different situations there. You have the former lumber yard further down Sumter, closer to Hull. You have a couple of the Cork and Bottle, former kind of strip center site, a little bit further north. You have a number of buildings that are kind of very light industrial buildings, and then of course you also have single-family homes. So to sort of trying to have a catch-all category that responds to that, there are sort of a number of different building types that might be appropriate. And in this one, we've put a number of stipulations on some of those. So the single-family home would be permitted, but only if access exists to a residential side street. So it would be one of those shallow frontage lots that exists on a corner. The retail and the mixed-use building, as well as the liner building, those would be ideal building types, particularly where you currently have commercial uses that have kind of fallen by the wayside. Again, I mentioned a little bit earlier about how, we built for a very particular type of retail at a very particular point in time. And some of those centers, for example, the Cork and Bottle Center, which is wholly in the township, I believe that's 100% vacant. And then across from there on the east side, even though it's in the city of Belleville, again, you have a large strip center that I couldn't tell you the percentage. They've got, I believe, Dollar Tree and a couple small neighborhood businesses in there, but it's more than, I believe, 50% vacant if you look at just count the number of individual spaces. I can't speak for floor area, but again, if, what we're trying to show here in the illustration is if you were to take that site that's dominated by a parking lot and build more of a traditional retail frontage right along there, or a low-cost liner building kind of solution to screen that area off from parking. That could be sort of the stepping stone to actually catalyzing some redevelopment, which, again, we've heard over and over through the last year is something that people desperately want to see along this corridor. And we can also talk about some of the other accessory structures that we've seen before being allowed in those shallow lots, such as, you know, a detached garage, an accessory dwelling unit, but again, those would have to be married to a principal residential structure. So this is kind of the most flexible of the lot types in terms of how that could be regulated for various building types. And then lastly, we'll get to the landlocked lots. And again, these are the ones that are more than one layer back on the west side of Sumter Road, currently have no access. And everything that we're talking about is hypothetical because it really is predicated on a new access road going in back there. If that were to happen, where would new development go? It wouldn't go toward the more traditional kind of suburban industrial park milieu that maybe you see in other places. The vision is to really keep that sort of idyllic rural character, which means a lot of preservation of the tree canopy, smaller scale of the structures, the buildings that would go back there. And so definitely would be oriented toward either further single-family home residential type development or artisanal entrepreneurial, and again, we say very light industrial uses. And we've talked about some of the ideas there. So when we're talking about very light industrial, again, the Artisan Studio comes into play, the Artist Cottage comes into play. Studio shed, roadside stands, workshops, as special land uses back there, maybe a barn-style building, or maybe a detached garage as an accessory building back there. But again, trying to maybe replicate sort of the character that you get closer to Sumter Road on that west side, but a little bit further back. And again, allowing these parcels that currently have no access to develop, but develop in a way that's consistent with the overall character of the corridor. Dan, do you have any comments you'd like to make at this point?
I think that's a good summary of all the lot types and recommended building types. So within those confines, we will then propose some zoning language that will define setbacks and permitted uses for all these different lot types and building types. I guess at this point, there are a few more things to go over. I think we quickly want to touch on the rural residential pattern that's being envisioned for this district in terms of how we want to prioritize certain types of residential development to occur, because one of the things that Adam mentioned early on was that there was no appetite to expand the urban services boundary with the sanitary service, and that will lead to there being limits on the zoning and limits on the land use that can happen south of Hull Road. And so, but what is allowed within that context is single-family homes and some institutional uses. When we think about single-family homes, though, we can that can develop in a number of ways. One of them can be kind of a traditional 1-acre lot platted subdivision. I think Adam's going to lay out some of the other alternate visions for that. But then if we just briefly go over that, we'll go over how this all gets wrapped into a recommendation for a mobility plan and a zoning plan. So Adam, go ahead and talk about the rural residential patterns.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And so this is an important component, which is, you know, when we think about the area south of Hull Road, we think about the rural residential area, that the ag estate zoning. The vested development rights there, 1-acre lots, 1-acre single-family residential lots. And there's potential for those lots to get developed at some point in the future. One of the biggest things we heard over and over again was the qualities that are sort of conferred on the area by having sort of untouched open spaces, especially south of Hull Road. That gives that area, that southern part of the township, once you cross Hull Road, you're almost in another world, an idyllic world. It's a reason people are moving to this part of the township, because many areas outward Wayne County and Washtenaw County are rapidly losing it. Some of the, if you think about Canton Township, Ypsilanti Township, over the last 20 or 30 years. And we've heard loud and clear time and again that residents don't want to see that same pattern transpire in the southern part of Van Buren Township. So at the same time, we want to make sure that we can accommodate somebody that's potentially interested in selling their property and developing it at the density that they're currently allowed to develop it at. And what we're looking at right now are three images that really, these kind of sketches came out of, you know, it's one of these things where you make some sketches and boy, they have a long life ahead of them. We just thought these were going to be throwaway sketches, and now they're here in our draft plan because they've communicated this idea so incredibly well. And so what we're looking at there on the top is more of a conventional model of rural residential development. What you might see there on the southern side of Hall Road at Sumter under conventional regulations. So just to keep the numbers simple, 1 dwelling unit per acre, we're going to assume that we're looking at 40-acre parcels. And so those are getting chopped up into 40 individual 1-acre lots with houses on them. And typically the way that would work is you would have sort of that cul-de-sac pattern, road pattern serving them. If we go down and we think about maybe making the lots a little bit smaller, keeping the same number of development units, but compressing them into smaller lots, what we call clustering, we can maybe look at some different configurations. And so the middle diagram is definitely very suburban in nature. And it's not, we're not showing it because it's necessarily desirable or in line with character, but we're trying to show the evolution from just taking 40 standard 1-acre lots, making them a little bit smaller, maybe to half an acre or 0.3 acres, 0.4 acres, something like that, and then taking the leftover space and preserving it. So the middle diagram is more of a, like I said, what you see in some of the PRDs around the township. We call it the Greenway Model, where that can be done and you get maybe a little bit more of a connected street grid, but it's definitely more conventionally suburban in character. If you move to the bottom, and you now look at lots that average about 0.3 acres, and they're clustered in a pattern that's built around a grid of streets. You've got the remainder of the land preserved on the periphery. Now you're actually getting to a point where you're keeping that village context. And if you look very closely at the northwest corner there of Hall and Sumter, or the top left-hand side of that diagram, you'll see a very distinct similarity to the lot pattern and rhythm and platting of the rule of subdivision. And I think that's very, you know, in terms of preserving that kind of idyllic rural character, preserving the lush open spaces around the outside, and yet getting sort of a walkable network that has precedent in the area. That precedent is immediately across the street, and people are happy with that and it works. Why not come up with a policy that allows that to happen there on the south side of Hall in lieu of a more traditional suburban or large lot kind of rural subdivision pattern? And I think that's kind of the key principle in terms of sort of a rural residential pattern area, is getting residential development to look more like sort of the traditional platted village or the traditional platted subdivision. Rouleau subdivision was platted actually back in 1923, and it had originally half-acre lots, and those lots were then split over the years as demand grew, especially after World War II, and so now the lots are various sizes. There are still some half-acre lots, but there are many 0.2 and 0.3 acre lots in there as well. And so by kind of shifting this from a model of gross density to a model of net density, and that's really what we're talking about. So the net density means that, you know, if you account for the total parcel, you're still getting the same number of development units. They're just clustered together rather than spread out on equally apportioned pieces of land. And so you can see that we've got some examples of that, visual examples of that in the plan, and talk about general design characteristics. that are going to be very important going forward, I think, through zoning to make this happen, which is things such as street layout needs to be grid-like in form so that you can create a walkable neighborhood. Again, keep in mind, the anchor lots are still there on those corners, and so assuming the anchor lots get developed with some sort of commercial use, to be able to have sort of a traditional neighborhood adjacent to that adds value on both counts, adds value to the commercial development and to, you know, the potential residents that get to have that rural open space right out one side of their house, and yet can also walk you know, to a traditional, hopefully, market or something of that nature, you know, on the other side. And so last but not least, we come to the mobility plan, and I think if we go to the map on the following page, we can see what we've been talking about this entire time. So from a mobility plan perspective, I'll wait until we get this.
Don't mind me.
Okay. We've got, and this map has gotten funky, and when we go absolutely final, it'll get redrawn a little bit. But for right now, we can go through the links that are labeled A, 1, 2, 3, and 4.
That should kind of do it. Okay. What we're trying to show is a couple of these lines should be dashed, and we'll make that adjustment. But there are some potential street networks that are emerging here, and I think we just want to demonstrate that those are potential future streets, not to be designed and laid out tomorrow. So
Exactly. We want to communicate that what you see there in the green, orange, and blue, the 1, 2, and 3 are potential future connections that would allow these areas further to the west of Sumter to be accessible. And so one would be, we call it Railroad Street, which generally follows the alignment of the railroad tracks to the south. Again, would require coordination with the city because that sawtooth pattern boundary puts a little bit of it in the city, but the idea is that it would plug into where the current Industrial Park Drive comes out at Sumter on the south side of the railroad tracks. And then extending to the south off of that might be a extension of Rouleau Avenue or might be a extension of Bach Road. I think those are the kind of 3 areas we identified because, you know, they create, again, even though it's not at sort of the neighborhood scale, it's at a more large scale, a regional scale, but connectivity, you know, a rectilinear grid, so to speak. And the idea is also that these would not be your traditional suburban, you know, arterial roads. These would be local in nature, and they would be designed to serve local users based on the development patterns that are presaged, you know, prior to this in the various lot types and their allowable building types. So we would be talking about, if you think about the way Back Road looks now, something of generally that width and profile going further to the north, and the same with Rouleau Avenue. We're not talking necessarily about anything that requires a larger investment or you know, a larger footprint than that. We get into number 4, and you see number 4 kind of runs alongside Sumter Road immediately to the east, and that is a slip street. And Dan, I may actually have you go back a page so we can look at that photo of what a slip street is. You know, when we talk about those shallow lots there along the east side of Sumter, and we're thinking about maybe those commercial spaces that could get enhanced by liner buildings to screen the parking, as well as just more of a vibrant mix of uses along that east side of Sumter Road. We also have to balance that with the consideration that, you know, Sumter Road is currently not the most ideal place for somebody to walk along. It's definitely not something somebody can bike along. And again, we heard that over and over again, which is that people who live south of Hull Road really like riding their bikes, but they don't feel comfortable riding into the city of Belleville, which is really the destination. If they want to go and go to A&W or get an ice cream cone or something on a nice day and they want to take their bike, unfortunately, the only way to do that is via Sumter Road, and right now that's not something that an inexperienced cyclist or someone who has kids would want to traverse. And so when we were thinking about, where would Sumter Road go, how would that evolve? It's already been identified as a candidate to have a multi-use pathway or some type of bike facility along it. But there needs to be further thought put into that, because right now we already have a number of curb cuts along Sumter, especially for those residential uses on the west side. And I think part of going back into the deep frontage lot discussion for a second, allowing further development to take place back there in conjunction with one of those road extensions would allow a property owner to close off some of those driveways along Sumter and then be able to access their properties via the rear. That's one way to remedy that on the west side. But of course, on the east side, if we're looking at redevelopment or new development of some of these other building types, we'd want to prevent the same type of thing from happening, just creating even more conflict points than there already are. And so the solution to that is the slip street. And that is simply a one-way parallel road. And you can see there on the bottom of that image of that spread, this is just one example of one. This is up in Oak Park along 9 Mile. And there's a different context, I understand, in Oak Park, but from a design perspective, this is a very similar treatment to what we might be proposing along Sumter. I think in the case of Sumter, there would be sort of more of a buffer. So where you see that left lane of parking, you might actually have all of that be a landscape buffer with your space for a non-motorized pathway. And then you would just have parking maybe along the right-hand side of that slip street. But what that does is it preserves sort of a walkable kind of pedestrianized street without taking Sumter Road and maybe urbanizing it to a level that really isn't keeping with our vision, right? And all of this is done to sort of propagate that vision of a semi-rural, idyllic kind of a context. And so by putting that hyper-local traffic off there on sort of a side street immediately parallel with a really nice landscape buffer, I think can solve a lot of those mobility and access challenges that currently are presented and would be presented even if redevelopment went forward without thinking about the road cross section at the moment. And so I believe, those are really the kind of 4 main parts of the mobility plan. We've got the lot types map, which Dan has showed you his fancy interactive version throughout my talk. And then last but not least, we can get into the zoning plan. Do you have anything I've missed at this point, Dan?
No, I can summarize the zoning plan. I think our tasks here, and you can chime in after I give a couple statements on this, but going back to the earlier image, everything that Adam just went through will get teased out through zoning as the tool to get this done. So the zoning ordinance, we're in the process of going through some pretty big revisions to enable a new Sumter Road mixed-use zoning district, which again is where we identify the principal permitted and special land uses that are allowed within this blue area on the screen. And nothing surprising. It's basically you can start to envision what would go inside of those buildings, whether they be single-family homes on the one side or a mix of different commercial, service, retail, restaurant, small craft and small manufacturing uses. But then we also will define setbacks that make those buildings responsive to the neighboring properties and make them minimize their impact on neighboring properties. And those are kind of the main components of what you'd see in a zoning district itself. You're going to see a schedule of regulations for the district. You're going to see setbacks for the district and permitted uses. Very similar to what we see in the Belleville Road-based mixed-use zoning district that's currently in the zoning ordinance. The other aspect of our zoning plan is to identify sort of an aesthetic standard for the entire corridor, and the way that we can do that is through what's called an overlay district. Also akin to what we've seen on Belleville Road with what we commonly know as the B-Rod, where we can impose additional requirements to make sure that all the properties have a common aesthetic, maybe a more stringent landscaping and streetscape standard. That being said, it's going to be something that's fairly simple and fairly scaled back to the scale of what you'll see on Sumter Road. This isn't a high-intensity suburban commercial corridor like Belleville Road is. It's going to be more kind of a finer touch of landscaping and streetscape requirements that you'd see in an overlay district. So those are the two main components of the zoning plan that we're working on right now to make this whole master plan amendment come to life. And that's going to be something that we'll bring back to you in a series of discussions later in the spring and later in the winter and spring. But that's how this all comes together. So that kind of summarizes what the zoning plan is there for, to take this overall plan forward. Anything you'd like to add on that, Adam?
No, Dan, I think that's sufficient. And I think, is there anything else that you think we need to cover, or should we?
I want to turn it over to our planning commission at this point. I think we've covered everything. And the chair can guide us here, but let me just save the question. At this point, we may not have any attendees left. So we do have one faithful colleague who's out there, but I don't see her hand raised. So back to the planning commission, if you'd like to discuss this and discuss the possible next step of forwarding it to the board for release for further review by our neighboring communities.
Thank you so much. Great presentation. Great job putting all of this together. Thank you so much to the subcommittee for the time and consultants and everybody. Open it up to planning commission comments, questions, anything for staff or Director Powell or Adam?
I have a question. First of all, how do we define extremely light industrial use? I mean, is that a term that we would use? I understand what we want out of it, but how do we define that? Or what type of term do we use in that process?
Yep.
Because if you say in light industrial, there's a whole gambit that falls underneath that, some of what we don't want in
Right.
that district.
There's a couple ways to address that. We have existing terminology in our zoning ordinance that deals with light manufacturing and heavy manufacturing. And those align closely with our existing industrial zoning districts, and they lay out anything from small scale metalworking to large scale automotive stamping. We can first determine that we want to remove those types of definitions from the ordinances that will apply to this district. And it may be that we pick certain aspects of those types of uses and definitions and put them into a new definition, or we might refer to some reference definitions like the term artisanal manufacturing, which there is a zoning definition for something like that, which is primarily making things that are created on site and sold on site. So that's where you can start to confine the type of manufacturing that you'd see, not geared so much toward distribution, but geared toward on-premise sale and production. And if you do have some aspect of distribution, you can also limit the size and scope of the industrial or the manufacturing by the building types that we've identified in the plan. So for example, the workshop building is a building type that's in this plan where you might see some manufacturing components, but it's limited to 5,000 square feet. A makerspace, similarly, it's limited. It's limited in where it can apply, and it's also identified as a special land use. So that's a long way of saying we will see if putting definitions in the ordinance to address that will cover some of the concerns, and we can also rely on the building sizes and building types to cover some of those concerns as well, and to start to rule out some of the more traditional manufacturing.
Okay.
And if I could also add, the building types approach, I mean, like Dan said, implicitly, what you're trying to do with that approach is get away from having to, hyper narrowly define every possible use, because then that puts you into a box where you're limiting things that don't currently exist in terms of uses, and then you're not getting, an area whose buildings can evolve, right, to meet future needs. And this has also been employed in the mixed-use district elsewhere, up Belleville Road there at the town center area, even though nothing is currently zoned as the mixed-use district. But that's strategy's also been employed there in the zoning ordinance.
Great question. Any other commissioners, any comments or questions?
I just would like to say, oh, I'm sorry, Jeff.
Oh, please
did
go
you?
ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you to Adam Cook and Dan. You shepherded us through this I felt very complicated and made it very, very easy for us. We even had like pictures of houses and, it was like, took me back to Old Maid where we were putting the matches together. It was delightful. And I also want to tell Callie, thank you, Commissioner Callie Barr and Jeff. It was awesome that we ensured that every time we met, we were capturing what the community requested. That was the big driver of us. I remember Commissioner Jar would say, well, how is the community going to receive this? And so that was very important to us. So thank you for helping us with that. And I believe the community will love this because we've met their needs and what they requested.
Commissioner Jar?
I'm looking forward to seeing the detailed zoning plan.
I'm very, very happy with how you translated all the data and information and then gave us some images of what potentially could look at the separate sites and start reshaping that corridor. Everybody did an amazing job on this project. Thank you. One last thing though, Director Power, this is just a draft. Could you walk us through really quickly on what the next steps would be moving forward, please?
Yep, certainly. So under state law, anytime a community updates its entire master plan, there's going to be a process that's mechanized through the state law that requires that we first, the Planning Commission is the body that kind of brews it up and turns it into a full draft. And then the Planning Commission, by state law, has to recommend that it's released to the board for their release to neighboring communities. So all the neighboring townships and cities and all the neighboring utility and service providers and even the railroads. If it's a full master plan like it was when we did the full master plan in 2020, there's a 2-month review period. For an amendment to the master plan, it's roughly a month and a half. It's 42 days. So that would be the next step, is forwarding this full draft to the board for their accepting the release of the plan for 42 days to be reviewed by the neighboring communities. Within that time frame, what we'd say is if there's any fatal flaws that people really come forward and there's a consensus to poke a big hole in the plan and change maybe the district's, the whole district boundary of the mixed use designated future land use district, or perhaps strikes an entire section of the plan, then we'd come back to the drawing board. But if there's minor changes, tweaks around the edges, language changes, clarifying text, then it proceeds through the process, and you'd have a public hearing to review it after that 42 days in full. And at that point, hopefully there's strong consensus among everybody who's seen the plan, and it moves forward for adoption by the board. So there's still a good 2 months left before this plan is formally adopted, if you vote to recommend moving it forward to the board tonight.
Great. Thank you so much for explaining that to us. So are we ready to take action on this with a recommendation to the board?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Commissioner Jar.
I move that the Planning Commission recommend to the Township Board of Trustees distribution of the full draft Sumter Road Corridor Plan for a 42-day review by neighboring jurisdictions.
Do I have support for the motion?
Support.
By Commissioner Jar, support by Commissioner Atchison. This is a recommendation to the Township Board. It's a roll call vote.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Motion passes. Again, great job, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brings us up to general discussion, which we moved item 1 up to the beginning, so we are on to item number 2, pending Planning Commission project updates from Director Power.
I'll just say at this late hour, I've provided a list of all the projects that you very esteemed planning commissioners have reviewed over the last few years that are pending further action or construction. And you can look at that list and let me know if you want any clarity on where things stand and what they're doing next. All these projects are still active in some form, and I'm glad to answer any questions about them.
Thank you so much, Director Power. Do you have anything else for general discussion from any of the commissioners? Oh, I am sorry. I was moving ahead quickly.
I usually don't say. I just wanted to share that last night at the Sumter Sumter Board of Trustees, they voted to ask the county for federal funds of $6 million for a bicycle pedestrian path from the city of Belleville along Sumter Road all the way down to Arcona Road and then into Crosswinds Marsh. And also Bemis Road from the Metro Park to Rawsonville. And I wondered how they could go through Van Buren, and they said, oh, the county doesn't give you the money. This is the federal funds that are coming through the county. They build it. So I thought, well, maybe the county could build it in Van Buren Township. Somebody asked, well, have you talked to Van Buren about it? And they said, oh, we don't get into their affairs. So when they get the plan, then they'll get into your affairs.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other comments, questions for, yes?
Dan, I don't see the project that we approved over there, the senior housing project there on Belleville Road.
Clover Development is not on the list.
Am I missing it?
It should be on the list, and it
Yeah,
is
looked
very
like
much
it was. Yeah,
active.
Good catch. Good catch, Brian. I didn't see it either. Yeah, it's not on there.
Thank you for catching that. Yes, Clover Development is still active. They are going through primarily questions about their final water utility design and fees associated with the water utilities, their stormwater design, going through the final steps of approval for their stormwater design with Wayne County and the township. So they're in between preliminary and final site plan review. And actually, they've had their building permit plans also reviewed and recommended for approval. So they're pretty far along. They just have to get through the final site plan steps with you.
Okay, I was just curious. I didn't see him on the list, and I wondered if something had happened to him.
Yeah, good catch. That should have been. Thank you.
Additional items for general discussion? We have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Support.
Support.
All in favor? Aye.
Meeting adjourned.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
You too.
Yeah, great discussion.
The Sumter Road, that just coming in brand new, I was able to follow along.
You had time to read it and see what was going on?
Yeah,
Great,
and
great.
I was able to follow along. It was like, oh, okay, I understand this, and then hearing the
Oh,
participant
good.
presentation. So that was really
Excellent. I'm glad to hear it. Well, welcome to the team for sure.
Thank you,
And
thank you.
it's not always so deliberative, and it's not always so empty.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Sometimes it's more administrative.
Uh-huh.
You know, people come in with plans, we review them, we check them. We're basically proofreaders. We ask good questions of people developing things, and then we, you know, for some things, we have the ability to decide to allow or not. For other things, we're just, you know, doing our stamp of review.
Turn the lights up high and.
Every meeting's a little different. It's really fun being on the planning commission. I'm glad you joined.
Yes, I'm happy to be here as
And
well.
now I gotta ask you, that thing you were writing on, that left-handed pad that had no ink stains on it, what was up with that?
It's called Remarkable. It's a
Oh.
digital.
Nice.
Yeah.
That is
And
cool.
I absolutely love it. It's
Remarkable. That
yeah.
is neat.
So it's a full blown my notepad, and I can